When talking about The Invisible Man, I haven't felt nearly as compelled to see a horror movie in theaters since A Quiet Place, almost 2 years ago. And the reason I went to see A Quiet Place in theaters was largely because of the tremendous and overwhelming critical acclaim it was getting, and I needed to see what everyone was talking about. Now, to be fair, the very last horror movie I saw in theaters was actually It Chapter 2, but only because I had waited to see the first one on streaming, and then I felt compelled to then see the sequel while it was actually in theaters because I had to continue the story. And let me say again, as I've said in the past, that I do not like horror movies, and I usually avoid them almost always. But when A Quiet Place came out, I was heavily intrigued by its very simple but effectively chilling premise. And that is to survive in a world where you had to be silent or else you get hunted and killed. And that concept personally intrigued me. And then once the critical praise came pouring through as it did, that's when the scale was tipped for me. And I ended up seeing it and loving it. And the reason I bring that up is because I had a very similar reaction to see The Invisible Man. Now, from the trailer, the concept definitely looked intriguing, not quite as interesting as A Quiet Place, but it definitely caught my attention, despite it being a horror movie. And once I saw all of the critical praise for this movie, just like A Quiet Place, I had to see what everyone was talking about. And thank God I did, because not only was this movie good, but it was powerful. So let's break this down. Now, it's amazing to me after watching this movie how terrified an empty room or any open space can make you feel, because you're dealing with a story where the main character is being stalked by her supposedly dead ex-boyfriend who has somehow made himself invisible. Now, when you break down the premise like that, it can sound like a cheap concept, but we'll talk about the overall film's message in a moment. But anyway, I just like how A Quiet Place relied on the simple element of silence to do the heavy lifting in building that tension. Something so simple to execute. All Invisible Man had to do was give us one empty room after another. Because when you have no idea where this Invisible Man is, the simple wide shot of a person walking through a living room is so stressful because you know someone is there and you're trying to guess constantly where they are in the room. And the way this film was shot and how they choreographed these sequences of always guessing where he might be was effective, innovative, ingenious, and shockingly simple some of the time. And I appreciate that, taking a very simple shot and adding so much tension to it by doing practically nothing. But on that note, I also loved the shots that we see throughout where it's almost like we're looking at the characters through the perspective of the Invisible Man, and therefore seeing how close he really is sometimes. I was on the edge of my seat this entire movie, and it takes off from the very beginning. Now, Elizabeth Moss is exceptional in this role, as she always is in every single role I see her in. And I loved how determined her character was, even though she started vulnerable and understandably fearful in the beginning, but had an amazing arc overall where I loved seeing her strength, cleverness, and determination break down her fear. And this is where the film boasted a powerful message about surviving and overcoming the power of an abusive relationship and the horrific level of manipulation that some people are capable of. And of course, this film is an exaggeration of that, but the message was powerful and provided a thoughtful commentary on the subject without feeling preachy at all. The film also has a tremendously cinematic score. Holy hell, almost at the level of Hans Zimmer, if you will. I was very impressed, and it only elevated this movie's quality that much more. There were only a few moments in the middle where I wondered if the movie had lost some of its steam, but boy was I wrong, because the last third really takes off, and when I thought we had reached the final climactic sequence, it just kept going after, and then when I thought we reached the end again, it just kept going, and there were a few twists that genuinely shocked me. The rest of the supporting characters in this movie were also very good. No, there was no weak link among them, in my opinion, but this movie definitely, hands down, belongs to Elizabeth Moss. I mean, she's definitely given the most screen time and that much more scenery to chew on, understandably. Yes, the Invisible Man is also the next main character, but you don't see him, so, I mean, I give praise to the writers for establishing a very significant character on screen without actually being on screen. But this is definitely Elizabeth Moss movie. No one else really outshines or really stands out, in a spectacular way to me. But everyone did a very fine job within their role. The Invisible Man is the type of horror movie that I would more or less classify as a high-intensity thriller. It's a survival movie, but the reason I could handle this type of horror movie was because that it isn't a demonic possession or torture porn or creepy ghost type horror movie, nor does it have terrifying clowns. The scariest images are basically empty rooms, and it's the thrill of survival that kept me engaged and rooting for Elizabeth Moss's character to triumph in the end. And this is the kind of horror movie that I can actually enjoy and get on board with. One with a clear message and relies on ingenious practical elements to create terrifying situations for the characters to survive in and then channel that fear into motivation to fight back. It's not scaring you for the sake of scaring you. There's more depth to this story, and that's how it won me over. Now, this movie is in no way related to A Quiet Place, but the only reason I am drawing, comparisons between the two is basically upon my conviction to see the movie based on not only the material it's presenting in a rather simplistic, ingenious way, but also the critical praise it's getting and wanting to be in on that conversation. Both of my feelings in going to see the movies are incredibly similar, if not exactly the same, and that's the only reason I really draw a comparison. They couldn't be more different in terms of movies. And so though this movie didn't quite pull at my emotions like A Quiet Place did, there's no doubt the masterful craft and work it took to make such a thrilling and powerful movie like The Invisible Man, without cheap gimmicks, nor relying on annoying cheap jump scares. It was a solid story with a great cast and a wonderful lead that elevated this source material in a way I don't think any of us were expecting. I'm going to give The Invisible Man an A-. And that's my review of The Invisible Man for you. I would be curious to know what you think, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. Thank you all again for tuning in, and until next time, I am Ryan Boehme signing off. Bye, everyone.